Wonderful. Well, whenever you're ready, this is Caroline McKinnon. Thank you so much for joining, and take it away.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from New York. First, a couple of disclaimers. I have a dog who quite often likes to join in webinars. So if you hear her, I apologize for that. And secondly, I am in the heart of New York and there are lots of sirens going on today. So apologies if you hear that going on outside. Thank you to Bounce English for setting this up. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for people to learn from each other and also to do some good. And thank you to all the speakers. I really need to speak to Julie and Emma more about that subject because it was fantastic. So thank you. I'm coming away now to talk about something that you can do with your students and something that promotes autonomous learning. I work a lot with refugees and immigrants, and quite often their time that they can spend in a classroom, especially now with technology issues, which have shown a huge disparity in the economic status of students and their availability to study online. So we've had to sort of develop more ways of giving them work that they can take offline. And this is something that I love to do, and it's called a web quest. Probably not new to many of you, but I just want to talk you through something that I've just recently done with a group of students. And the reason I love to do it is because it kind of links back a little bit to what Julie and Emma were talking about, allowing the students to sort of guide the conversation, but also, you know, not putting limits on what your students know and their knowledge. You know, New York City is a city of immigrants, but it's a vastly different city of immigrants depending on where you come from. So I wanted my students really to tell me about New York on this web quest. And the one thing that they told me from start to finish is the symbol of the Statue of Liberty, that it's become, over the last few years, it's become more and more important to them as immigrants because it has been used in so many protests. It's been used in protests against the immigration. It's been used in Black Lives Matter. It's been used in every anti-Trump protest that you will see in the US. And if you are familiar with New York City, you'll know that New York is probably the least welcoming place to Donald Trump on the planet. So when I asked students, firstly, I gave them the map of New York using Google Earth. If you're not using Google Earth in your classroom, I hugely recommend it because it allows the students to set projects themselves and tour places that maybe show you their hometown, which they wouldn't get an opportunity to before. So we're going to go and have a look today at the web quest steps that a student would do. And as I said, they mentioned the Statue of Liberty. The beauty of Google Earth is Google Earth takes you directly into places and it links up with information to different websites. So from here, a web quest, if you're not familiar with it, is really allowing your students to choose their own adventure. Now, one of the types of books I loved when I was a kid was Choose Your Own Adventure. So, you know, if you slayed a dragon, go to page 25. And web questing is exactly like that, but the students take control of their learning. So for example, from here, the students can tell you what they want to learn. Now that is a huge, you know, really it's a question that has no answer. So you do need to have a little bit of guidance for the students. So I want to show you what I started off, and I will just bear with me as I bring it up. So I gave the student a couple of questions that I wanted them to look at and websites. And here I asked them to look at New York City, the Statue of Liberty, and the Empire State Building, which came up later as well. I asked them to find out some basic facts about the Statue of Liberty. And the reason I'm showing you this now is because it was an absolute failure. And as a teacher, I think it's really important to recognize that some things just don't wash with our students. My students didn't want to talk about how long the arm is, when it was built, who gave it to New York. They wanted to talk about what it represented. And to them, what it represented was basically liberty, immigration. They wanted to talk about immigration, which allowed us to move to Ellis Island and take a tour of Ellis Island, which is the Immigration Center and the Museum of New York. Through this, it allowed students to actually look at the history of immigration in New York. It allowed them to compare the experiences of people who came before them to now. It allowed the students to take an online test to see whether they would be permitted into the US in previous times. I'm a US citizen and a UK citizen now, but interestingly enough, when I first moved to the US, I would have been banned from entry on the basis that I was unmarried. And this is important because then it led the students to discuss immigration from a woman's point of view, but immigration from a male point of view as well, and what would constitute a good immigrant, what different cultures would bring to immigration. So as you can see, my assumption at the start of this really was that I thought students would want to learn about, the fact that the Statue of Liberty came from France and she was holding a book and she had the poem on the bottom of it. But in fact, my students wanted to talk about immigration, but how immigration practices have not changed as much as we think that they've changed. Now, for context in this, my students are very, very low level. There are lots of literacy problems. Many of them have fled war zones. They have spent years in different refugee camps. Quite often they have learned different languages and then suddenly they've been relocated to the US. And they are going through the process of immigration in a time which is very unstable. But with something like this, they might not have had the language for it, but they were striving to find the language for it because it was something that they were passionate about. I know for a fact that if I had stuck with my original lesson plan and not allowed them to have some autonomy in their learning, that they would have basically came up with sentences like, the Statue of Liberty is green, the Statue of Liberty is in New York. Instead, we actually dealt with very, very complex cultural questions in limited English, which brought up the vocabulary that to them was very key and very important. It allowed us then to tour around somewhere like, let's see if we can bring you into the museum a little bit more. We looked at photos in the museum. We looked at, we discussed how it might have been to stay in this immigration processing center. The students talked about their own experience. They compared the current immigration or the views in their own country. It touched upon race because the students immediately noticed a lack of representation in photos. Through the investigation around the site, if you can see the map, they discovered that, for example, if you were coming from certain parts of the world, then you were naturally more likely to be turned away than other people. It wasn't all a very, I want to say it wasn't as heavy as this conversation starts. It was an amazing conversation because the students really wanted to share. I think that when students become comfortable in an area, they want to share and they will find their voice. They might not have the English, and I think sometimes in English language teaching, and it comes back to being institutionalized in many ways, we get so focused on, is that structure right? Are the students using the correct grammar? Instead of what is the student trying to tell me? And the students will get there. It's communication that needs the focus. The grammar will come afterwards, which I know is contrary to everything that you're taught, when you're becoming a teacher. And I'm a teacher trainer. So, I'm telling teachers, you need to make sure that they know the grammar. The fact is, with many people, that doesn't matter. Anyone. I mean, I can communicate in German, but I can't tell you a single thing about German grammar. But I can certainly order beer and get understood. But this leads to many other things. From this, a student then brought to me the fact that there is a whole series of cameras from the Statue of Liberty, which are down at the moment because, New York is having a few issues today. But it allowed, again, for the student to take control of the lesson and bring to our attention the camera, and we could talk about a wider range of subjects. So, for example, when we led to this camera, we ended up speaking about economic differences, because If you look at, this is downtown Manhattan, you're seeing here, this is Wall Street, this is the rich financial area of New York. And students knew to express that. They knew to express uptown, downtown, you know, sort of like Brooklyn. And it led to a conversation about immigrant areas and why they were immigrant areas. A student pointed out that they didn't choose to live in a Yemeni area, but they could only afford to live in a Yemeni area. And the resources were there for them as well. From this, another student brought up the dreaded Wikipedia. I'm not a fan of Wikipedia in teaching at all. However, the student brought it up and they'd highlighted certain things. They wanted to know about the poem by Emma Lazarus that is on the Statue of Liberty about welcoming people in. And from that, the students then Googled and found out about a protest, which was about immigration, where a woman scaled the Statue of Liberty. That led to a social justice conversation. I will point out that these were introductory conversations, but they told me the things that students were very interested in learning going forward. So I followed up on a lot of these conversations. Anything that didn't really warrant a conversation, didn't really warrant going there with the, you know, with planning another lesson. But when the students really wanted to talk, I mean, the conversation that we had about economic justice led to a week of lessons on that subject, from everything from a practical point of view, from jobs that are available to people in you know, who don't have necessarily enough English, etc., right the way through to the way that women are paid differently depending on their race, depending on their culture as well. Another student wanted to talk about the history of the Statue of Liberty. They took us to the History Channel. They showed us different parts of the history. They wanted to compare it to the history of immigration in their own country. This student was from Iran, and they really wanted to talk about how Iran went from being incredibly welcoming and open society to them becoming a very closed society. And they wanted to relate it to what was happening here in the US at the time. Again, if we want to focus on just a pure language level, we wouldn't have gotten to this conversation, but also this student would never have been able to express their opinions about the subject. You know? We also found a video, a 2-minute tour of the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island. So here's the thing with the web quest, because I don't want to go like too much on what the students were doing, but the thing is with the web quest is I set out teaching with a certain expectation of what the students would want to learn from my point of view, what I thought would be beneficial to their English language skills. I thought it would be great for them to practice adjectives and to practice directions and, you know, all very, very touchy-feely, fluffy information. It would never have occurred to me that the Statue of Liberty to them was such an emotive statue. And I'm not sure why I wouldn't have thought that, because to me, every time I see it, you know, I feel as an immigrant myself, it's something that touches me. So I feel that I actually did my students a disservice by not giving them the power to have that same feeling. I just assumed they wouldn't. And because of that, they told me that they were interested in immigration. They took me down that road. Now, the language that they actually learned that day was very, very beneficial. It might not have formed any textbook structure of, you know, past simple, past continuous, etc. But what it did do was give them accessible language, vocabulary that was relevant to their everyday life. We need to understand really where our students are coming from. Not every language learner is the same, and not everyone's need is the same. Many of the community that I work with, their need is more functional English. They want to talk about things with their neighbors, with their community. They don't really need to have the strong structure of academic English or grammar. They just need to be able to talk about things that they are interested in. And that's vastly different from the students I teach who want to go to college. I think that this one size fits all of education is something that really does need to change. And I think that the opportunities that we've been given through being forced to go online have allowed many people to look at what we're actually delivering and to see what is working and what is failing with students. In New York right now, we're in week, I don't know, 13, 14 of lockdown. We're under mass protest. Our students have basically told us that they want to know what's going on. They want to understand what it means when we talk about police brutality. They want to know what it means when we talk about racism. And as Julie and Emma mentioned before, that textbooks don't deal with that. And we need to. And we have this internet and we have this whole online learning platform that we don't need to curate the way we would curate a class. We need to allow our students to go out there and find the information that they would bring back to us. It's about empowering the learner to really explore language from their viewpoint. As native speakers, viewing the language from our viewpoint will never have the same effect. I remember learning languages myself, and the things that I was curious about was certainly not situations like the cat is on the table. You know, I really wanted to learn something of more meaningful value. You know? So I think it's really something that we need to address as educators, that we're coming from a point of privilege. We're privileged as native speakers or near native speakers. Most of us, if you look demographically, most of us are white, middle class. We see ourselves as being so worldly because, you know, we've met somebody from Kazakhstan, we've taught somebody from Kazakhstan. And so often we make assumptions about our students and their language abilities and also their culture. We need to be able to use something like a webquest to give the students the autonomy to tell us about their culture, to tell us what it means to be an Uzbek in New York City, for them to explore what they're interested in. That will be the key to the students learning effectively and to produce the language. Now, it's very interesting like that this is happening today, because I'm currently in a series of meetings with a group of universities in New York where we are trying to coordinate an ESL education seminar set of workshops for teachers and students on what is going on in the country. New York City is on top of each other. The protests are everywhere. Students have, I think we would fail as educators if we didn't allow them to have access to what was going on in the same way. And that means, you know, it has to start with educators. I hate to say it, let's rip up some of the textbooks. Let's move away from it and let's let our students learn from their point of view. So if a student says to you, I want to talk about Black Lives Matter, I think that Black people are lazy. And I'm using that as an example because a student actually used it the other day. A Black person is lazy. I don't believe that this man was contributing much to life. Well, this sits uncomfortably with me as a human, but as an educator as well, I actually think it is my duty to challenge that assumption, to get the student to go and do the research, to come back with facts, to read about it, to educate themselves. Not for me just to tell them they're wrong. You know, we're not here for that. We're not the judge and jury on what is right and what is ethical. We can only guide the students to that conclusion themselves. It was an amazing learning experience for myself as well as the student. And, you know, after a lot of debate, I decided to talk to the student about how it made me feel. And, you know, this is the sort of the final thing I really want to mention when we're talking about this as well. WebQuest allow for feelings in ways that textbooks don't. If you use a textbook and you're learning about the Statue of Liberty, the most you're ever going to get with an emotion is, what does it make you feel when you look at the Statue of Liberty? That's not really a real feeling. That's a staged learning where you're trying to elicit one type of language and nothing else. We should be asking more questions of our students that get them to ask more questions as well. So for example, when a student is looking at the Statue of Liberty, what does it make them represent? What comes to mind? You know, ask questions that attach to their feelings. Our students have a lot of feelings and they have a lot more going on than sometimes I think we give them credit for, because we rely so heavily on the level of English they're at as opposed to the level of humanity they're at. And this student who considered Black people to be lazy and not contribute, when we started to talk about it, this student started to talk about, you know, the student was Ukrainian, and when he could got round to the point himself of associating how Ukrainians were treated by Russians and that situation, and put himself into the point of view, he came back round to regretting what he said. I'm not saying he changed his mind, because, you know, it was one conversation, but regretted expressing it without finding out more about the person he was talking about. We're never going to get major breakthroughs. It's not that we're going to teach a lesson and suddenly our students are going to be knowledgeable on all these subjects. All we're doing is opening the door. It's actually for the students to step through. And as teachers, I believe that we are the ones with the keys to open all the doors and let them step through and let them tell you which room or which doorway is more interesting to them. And you'll probably have a much more worthwhile teaching experience, as well as a much easier teaching experience, because if your students have chosen the subject, they're naturally more engaged than if you've chosen the subject yourself. So I'm going to stop here, but I'm welcome any questions that anyone might have about this subject. And please do definitely ask questions or just say hello from where you are. I know that everyone's probably looking for a break more. I'm looking for the chat now.
Yeah, there's been a lot of great conversation as you've been talking on the chat about how this is such a unique way to engage the students. You can, of course, read the chat. So definitely, if there's any questions, please feel free to go off of mute and ask your questions or put them in chat.
I really, the other thing I would say is you don't need to invent these yourself. There's if you went to something as simple as, you know, I'm trying to think, One Stop English, I believe they have webquests. It really depends what you want the goal to be through this. It's, you know, there are plenty of resources out there. It's really how much work you want to put into it. I like to really personalize it to my students, because the students I'm teaching don't fit into any traditional box. Even within one class, there is no given demographic of a student. I have a student who is, if you ask her, she's maybe 60, but she doesn't know because there's no record of her birth. And she's never learned to read or write in her own language. So English is, you know, forget about reading or writing. She just needs to be able to produce it. And I have another student who was halfway through medical school when her country erupted into civil war and she had to flee. You know, it really is, we need to move away from this idea of one size fits all. And you know, I mean, if we just take one textbook, any random textbook, there is no way that that textbook works in London, Malaysia, New York alone, because just the locations the students choose to study, if they do choose to, says a lot about them as well. Yeah. So thank you all very much. I know that it's time to hand on over But I do appreciate everything everyone's doing today. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been so good to see so many faces from the past. So thank you.
That was just incredible. Wow. You know, this has been such an amazing morning. I have been on since about 6:45 my time, so I've missed a couple sessions, but I'll be checking them out. I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's here and everyone who's been presenting. It has been just an incredible, I'm like really almost dumbfounded at the quality of things people have come up with to talk about, just so much great information, so much to think about, and such a wide variety, which I've really enjoyed. So thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who has joined just to watch. We are going to have a short break. We'll have a few more sessions here. So please come back. And thank you again, everybody. Yay. And please, if you can, donate to one of the 3 organizations that we have found, or if there's a local food bank in your area that you'd prefer to donate, that's cool. Go where you put this money, if you can do it, where you'd like to put it. Thank you again.